Alrighty, so in this video, I'm going to go through the IB Economics Higher Level Paper 2. This is the October/November 2022 paper. And in this video, I'm going to do question 2 of this paper. In a previous video, I did question 1. And so today, we're just going to go through question 2. So this is question 1. This is not the one we're after. I've already covered this in a previous video. If you are interested in doing question 1, then check out the previous video on question 1. But we are going to be instead looking at question 2. So 2, again, we've got a bunch of texts here that we have to read, and these relate to the country of Lebanon. And once again, I'm going to assume that you've already read these texts, or if you haven't, you can easily hit pause and just have a quick read as to what these texts are about. So again, I've got a few texts D, E, and F, and the question, and I've got a table full of economic data, and the question will begin proper somewhere down here. Okay, so let's begin by looking at this first one over here, which is part A, part 1. And this is asking us to define the term humanitarian aid indicated in bold in text D, paragraph 2. So let's have a look at text D, paragraph 2. There we go. Here's text D, paragraph 2, just this one over here. So this is saying that infrastructure in Lebanon is poor, water and sewage systems are basic, and roads are inadequate. Electricity supply is unreliable, with people going without power for much of the day. In 2020, major buildings, including food storage buildings, schools, and hospitals were damaged. In Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, this was concerning as 85% of the country's food arrives from Beirut. Fortunately, humanitarian aid was given by the international community to help rebuild the damaged buildings. Right. So this is the term here, humanitarian aid, that we have to define and explain. Right. Let's head on over to my working space. So this one is pretty easy, I think. We just got to straight up define what humanitarian aid means in the context of the article. So I would probably say something like, humanitarian aid refers to assistance provided by governments, organizations, or individuals to address immediate needs and alleviate human suffering caused by disasters, conflicts, or crises. It typically includes emergency relief such as food, shelter, medical supplies, and reconstruction support. In the case of Lebanon, humanitarian aid refers specifically to the support provided by the international community to rebuild essential infrastructure in Beirut, such as food storage facilities, schools, and hospitals following the 2020 disaster. This aid was crucial because these facilities are vital for Lebanon's food security and the well-being of its population, given that 85% of the country's food arrives through Beirut. And there you have it. So that's how I would define this term humanitarian aid. Again, I've probably given a little bit more than what you need. But yeah, so the first paragraph over here, we've got kind of like this kind of straight up sort of definition-y bit. And in the second paragraph, I like to sort of apply that definition to the context of the current problem, which is how do we apply it to, so first paragraph saying, okay, this is what humanitarian aid is, right? It's blah, blah, blah. And second paragraph says, okay, well, in the case of Lebanon, this is how it applies. So yeah, you don't really have to do both, I guess, but just if you're going to cover your bases, I'd probably have that second paragraph just to link it back to the original question. Okay, now the second bit of part A, which is A part 2, is asking us to define the term monopoly indicated in bold, text E, paragraph 2. So let's go to text E, paragraph 2, and we'll have a read of what the term monopoly is. All right, so here we go, text E, paragraph 2, over here. Mismanagement of the state-run electricity and telecommunications sector has resulted in unreliable services and high telecommunication prices. These state-run monopoly firms make losses, and the electricity sector relies heavily on government subsidies, putting pressure on the budget deficit. Okay, so once again, just got to straight up define what this monopoly term means. Okay, so let's give this a bit of space. So as before, my strategy here is just to straight up define the term monopoly. It's going to be sort of like a textbooky definition, and then the second paragraph will apply it. We'll link it back to, the context of Lebanon. Okay, so what I would say is something like, a monopoly is a market structure in which a single firm dominates the market and is the sole provider of a particular good or service with no close substitutes. This firm has significant market power, allowing it to influence prices and output levels. In the case of Lebanon, the state-run electricity and telecommunications sector in Lebanon operate as monopolies, meaning they are the only providers of these services in the market. However, despite their dominant position, these firms are inefficient, offering unreliable services and high telecommunication prices. Their inability to operate profitably has resulted in financial losses and reliance on government subsidies, contributing to Lebanon's budget deficit. All good? I think that'll do us. Okay, so let's move on to the next bit. Now, in part B, part 1, we have to use the information from table 3 to calculate the 2015 gross national income for Lebanon. Okay, so where's 2000? Oh, there you go, table 3. So here I've got a table of economic data. And I'm going to flick back to this table in a moment. So what I want to do is just want to move on to our working space. Now, this one's pretty easy points if you know what you're doing. It's just 3 or 4 lines of pretty basic math. We're going to start off by identifying that gross or total national income is the sum of GDP, which is what you make for yourself, and net income from abroad. So we're going to have, let's say, GNI, gross national income, is equal to GDP, which is what you make for yourself, plus net income from abroad. So this is how much you make from overseas sources. So the second line expands on this. We're going to get GDP. Now, this second bit, this idea of net income, well, net income is earnings minus expenses. In this case, it would be income received from abroad, which is what you earn from your overseas activities, minus income that is sent abroad. So we go income received. I'm going to run a space here. From abroad. Minus income sent abroad. Okay, and then the final line is we just got to fill in the blanks. So back to this table over here, we see that GDP is $50 billion in 2015. Then for the income received, we got 2.4 billion received, and then income sent we have 2.9 billion cents. So you can see we're actually sending more income overseas than we are receiving. So I'm going to plug these three numbers, 50, 2.4, and 2.9, back into our little equation. So here we've got 50 billion for GDP plus now the income received was 2.4 minus the income that was sent was 2.9. That's going to be equal to 49.5 billion. So that's I guess USD. Oh gosh, I should probably have done this a little bit better. So USD 45.9 billion. And there you have it. So that's a easy point if you know what you're doing. Now the next bit, part B, part two, whatever, it's asking us to sketch a demand and supply diagram to show the impact of an indirect tax on the market for social media applications such as WhatsApp. We'll look at text E, paragraph 1. Okay, so let's move to text E, paragraph 1. Here we go. So text E, further changes facing Lebanon. Okay, so paragraph 1 is saying social unrest is prevalent and intensified when the government suggested raising revenue by imposing an indirect tax on social media applications such as WhatsApp. As the government, keywords are indirect tax. As the government struggles to pay its debts, people are concerned that subsidies on necessities such as wheat, medicine, and fuel will be removed. Okay, so what do we have to do again? Right, so we're going to sketch a supply and demand diagram to show the impact of this indirect tax. All right, let's get it done. Right, so as usual, this is just a straight up supply and demand graph, nothing too fancy about it. We're going to have price on the vertical axis, going to have something like quantity on the horizontal. I've got a little demand curve, and we're going to have a supply curve. Now, the tax, if it's going to be indirect tax, they're probably going to tax the supply side. So that's going to shrink the quantity of supply from, say, S1 to, quantity of supply, shift the supply curve from, say, S1 to S2. And let's say we might have some sort of equilibrium at point A, and we're going to move to, say, point B. And we're just going to sketch through the impacts of this indirect tax. So as you can see, pretty standard supply and demand diagram. You got the demand side, got the supply side, initial equilibrium at point A, and as you implement that tax, that's going to move the supply curve backwards. Because obviously, tax is going to be it's not going to increase supply. It's going to make it more difficult to supply this thing. So supply is going to cut back from S1 to S2. Equilibrium will move from point A to point B, and then as a result, we have both we're stuck with both higher prices, as well as a reduction in the quantity of the good or service being supplied. Okay, so after you've got your little diagram, then you probably want to provide some commentary. And the commentary is going to look like, let's go down a little bit. An indirect tax is a tax imposed on goods or services that is collected when intermediaries like businesses are passed on to the government. When such a tax is applied to social media applications, the following effects occur. Supply curve shifts upward, left. The tax increases the cost of providing the service, reducing the effective supply. For every price level, providers now need to charge more to cover the tax, shifting the supply curve upward from S1 to S2. Higher equilibrium price. The tax leads to an increase in the price paid by consumers. This is reflected in the diagram by the movement from the initial equilibrium price, P1, to the new higher price, P2. Lower equilibrium quantity. The higher price reduces the quantity demanded, leading to a lower equilibrium quantity, Q2. Compared to the original. Q1. Tax revenue. The vertical gap between the original supply curve and the new tax-inclusive supply curve represents the amount of tax per unit. The government collects revenue equal to the tax per unit multiplied by the new equilibrium quantity, as indicated by the shaded area. Okay, so I've just realized that I make mention of this oops. If there's tax, and didn't really draw the tax bit, so we should probably do that. So if we wanted to be, if you wanted extra points, you could indicate that this is going to be this little area here, this shaded area, that's going to be the tax revenue. Yeah, but I'm not sure if you need to do that bit. Anyway, so yeah, that's what it will look like. Excuse me. So yeah, so you would start with the diagram, and then you have sort of a few bits of text here, a few bits of text here to explain. Yeah, basically just explain what the diagram is. Okay, so pretty standard kind of approach to answering these questions. You get 2 marks, so 1 mark for the diagram, probably another mark for the explaining bit. Let's move on. So question 2, part C, using a PPC diagram, explain the impact of the damage to the major buildings in Beirut on Lebanon's productive capacity. Text D, paragraph 2. Let's go to text D, paragraph 2. Over here. So infrastructure in Lebanon is poor. Water and sewage systems are basic and roads are inadequate. Electricity supplies unreliable, with people going without power for much of the day, and blah, blah, blah. So in 2020, major buildings, including food storage rooms, were damaged in Beirut. This was concerning, as 85% of the food arrives through Beirut. Unfortunately, humanitarian aid was given to the damaged building. Right. Okay, so the PPC stands for the Production Possibilities Curve, and I'm going to assume you're familiar with this concept, so I don't have to go back and re-explain what the whole thing means. So to begin with, we kind of need to know what we're sketching on the vertical and horizontal axes of the PPC. It could be any 2 things, apples and oranges, or butter and peanuts, or whatever. In general, we can just use something like capital goods versus consumer goods. Capital goods are things like equipment, machinery, and so forth, whereas consumer goods are stuff that we consume, like food and clothing. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and draw our PPC. So as I mentioned, we've got something like, let's say, consumer goods on the vertical, and let's say we've got capital goods on the horizontal. They don't have to use exactly these 2. You can just even use A and B, or X and Y, or whatever, as long as we are able to sort of depict sort of production within the country. Okay, so now I've got our axes. We can just sketch the PPC, which is kind of like this bendy line that connects the two axes. So let's go PPC. I'll call it PPC1 or something. And what we're doing to answer the question. Now, in general, if there is damage to major buildings and other kinds of productive assets, then this will hurt our ability to make stuff and things. And what's actually going to happen is that the PPC will contract or shift inwards. Again, here I'm kind of assuming that you've got like this working knowledge of what a PPC is. If you don't really understand what this means, then you might have to go back and review your materials. Okay, so drawing the diagram alone is not enough. We obviously need to provide some commentary along with this as well. So I would say something like the production possibilities curve represents the maximum combination of goods and services an economy can produce given its available resources and technology. Assuming imperfect factor substitutability, the PPC will be concave. Or in shape. Suppose the economy can produce two types of goods: capital and consumer goods. Damage to key infrastructure, such as food storage buildings, schools, and hospitals, reduces the economy's productive capacity. This is depicted by a contraction of the PPC from PPC1 to PPC2. PPC1 to PPC2. As a result, the economy can produce fewer combinations of goods shown by points A to B. And again, I've just realized I haven't really shown these 2 points. So we just pick any 2 points on the PPC and we just kind of go, well, look, this is point A and let's say this is point B. And that kind of shows us the sort of reduction in the combination of these two things that the country can produce. Okay, so once again, okay, so this one's a 4 marker, so 4 marks. You probably get a couple marks for correctly drawing the diagram, and then another couple of marks for the exposition or the explainy bit. Cool. Let's move on. Now, in the fourth bit, fourth part, part D, using an aggregate demand / aggregate supply diagram, explain how falling remittances may affect Lebanon's real output. All right, so I see here a couple of things we're going to do. We're going to use the aggregate demand supply diagram, and then we're going to talk about this thing called how this effect of falling remittances may affect Lebanon's real output or real GDP. And we're told to look at text E paragraph 3, so let's go look at text E paragraph 3. So here, Lebanon currently has a managed exchange rate system with the Lebanese pound linked to the US dollar. However, the government is finding it difficult to maintain the exchange rate at the desired level due to insufficient reserve assets. Recent falling remittances, low levels of exports, and lack of foreign direct investment are placing downward pressure on the Lebanese pound. Lebanon has limited natural resources and a small manufacturing industry, thus relies heavily on imports. As a consequence, the gradual depreciation of the Lebanese pound has led to cost-push inflation. Wow, so there's quite a lot of stuff sort of packed into this paragraph over here. Let's break it down in the working section. So this question is about remittances. Now, a remittance, it's about remittances. Now, a remittance is money that workers overseas send back to their home countries. So, for example, if you went and got a job overseas, you're working hard and eventually get paid, you might decide to send some of that money back to your folks at home because, you're a good person and all. And that's what's referred to as a remittance. So this question is asking what would happen if less of these remittances make their way back to Lebanon. Now, the main effect would be that there would be less income coming in and household consumption would fall and aggregate demand shrinks. Now, although it's not specifically stated in the question, if you read the paragraph, they also mention falling FDI, which stands for foreign direct investment, and this is going to have a supply side effect contracting the supply curve. So the combined effect is a reduction to both aggregate demand and supply and a massive reduction to real GDP in the nation. So that's going to be our strategy moving forward. We're going to have this aggregate demand supply diagram, and we're going to depict both a falling aggregate demand and supply due to these falling remittances, as well as the FDI effect. And then we're going to have a couple paragraphs down below this to explain essentially kind of explain what the diagram means. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the diagram. So for aggregate demand and supply, remember, we've got things like price levels or prices, let's say prices, or price, I guess we'll call it price level. I'm not quite sure what terminology that your instructor prefers to use, but, call something like price level, average prices, it's probably sufficient. And over here, we have like our GDP on the horizontal axes, and then we've got our aggregate demand curve, we'll call this AD1, and we have our aggregate supply curve, we'll call this AS1. Now, as we have previously discussed, the reduction in those remittances would lead to less income coming in, and therefore household consumption will fall because consumption, income equals consumption, and consumption is one of the four components of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is going to shrink from, let's say, 81 to 82, and then at the same time, we're going to have less aggregate supply as well because of that falling, those falling FDI levels. You don't really have to do this bit, but kind of do it for the sake of completeness. Okay, so the combined effect from this shrinkage of both aggregate demand and supply is that you can see they're going to have this massive drop in output from Y1 to Y2. Okay, so now we just have to essentially just put some text or some commentary around this. So what should we say? Oops. Remittances are funds sent by workers abroad to their home country. In Lebanon, remittances represent a significant source of income and demand. A reduction in remittances impacts aggregate demand through lower household consumption and investment. Since consumption and investment are two significant components of aggregate demand, this will result in a fall in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. The falling remittances, low levels of export, and lack of foreign direct investment are placing downward pressure on the Lebanese pound, and as a result, the currency depreciates. When this happens, firms that rely on imported inputs, such as raw materials, will face higher costs, leading to a fall in aggregate supply from AS1 to AS2. The combined effect is a large reduction in our GDP from Y1 to Y2. The impact on average price levels is uncertain depending on which effect, aggregate demand or supply, dominate. If the fall in aggregate supply is greater than the reduction in aggregate demand, then the net effect will be higher prices and cost push inflation. And there you have it. So that's probably that'll be sufficient. So again, 4 markers, you get probably 2 marks for getting the diagram right, and then another couple of marks for just kind of doing the explaining part, the explanation bit. Okay, good. Let's move on. Okay, so question 2, part E. Let's scroll down a little bit. Using an exchange rate diagram, explain how Lebanon's current account balance could affect the Lebanese pound. Text D, paragraph 3. So let's go have a look at text D, paragraph 3. Text D, paragraph 3. Despite a history of inflows from luxury tourism and remittances, which refer to money sent by foreign workers to their home country, there is a persistent current account deficit. To help with this, the Lebanese Central Bank has used high interest rates to attract financial inflows. Additionally, the government has borrowed funds from overseas. However, the misuse of these funds and overspending have contributed to one of the highest foreign debts in the world. Lebanon recently defaulted on foreign debt payments worth 1.2 billion euros, which damaged its international credit rating, making it difficult to access loans needed to help solve its current economic problems. Wow, so a lot of problems faced by the country. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we've got to use this thing called an exchange rate diagram. So go back here. So we've been told to use an exchange rate diagram, which we will do. Then we've got to explain how this current account deficit will affect the Lebanese pound, so essentially their foreign exchange rate. Okay, all right, let's do this. To start off this question, we've got to look at this thing called an exchange rate diagram, which shows us the demand and supply of foreign exchange. It just looks like a normal supply and demand, but instead of the price, say in dollars and cents, which we might see in a regular demand curve, we have the exchange rate because this represents the price of foreign exchange. So let's draw our diagram. So as I mentioned, instead of the price, we're going to have something like the exchange rate. And then we're going to have a demand for foreign exchange, or demand for the Lebanese pound, and a supply for the Lebanese pound. So we'll just call these, what do I call these things? We'll just call these Lebanese pounds. Lebanese pounds. Pounds. Oh, gosh. Lebanese pounds. Okay. Once we've set up our foreign exchange diagram, we just have to work our way through how the current account deficit will affect the supply and demand of foreign exchange. Now, put simply, a current account deficit means you are importing more than you are exporting. If you are importing more, that means you have to buy more foreign currency, and to do this, you supply your own currency in exchange, right? So imagine you're planning to go on holiday. And before you do that, you have to go to like a bank or something and say, give me some foreign currency. in exchange, you have to give up some of your own currency, which is like supplying more of your own currency. Then on the flip side, if your country is exporting less, then foreigners will demand less of your currency. So this demand will go down, and this causes a left shift in the demand for your currency. So the combined effect is an increased supply and falling demand of the domestic currency with an overall decrease in the exchange rate. So let's go ahead and sketch these through these changes through in the diagram. Right. So first thing, we're going to have an increase in supply of foreign exchange. Let's say from S1 to S2, increased supply of Lebanese pounds, I should say. So this is where we're saying, oh, okay, if we want to buy more foreign imports, then in order to do that, I have to supply more of my currency into foreign exchange markets to buy that foreign currency. So here, this is like when you go to the bank and say, hey, give me some US dollars, or give me some, I don't know, euros or whatever, depending on where you live. And in exchange, I'm going to give you some of my currency. Then on the flip side, remember we said that if foreigners are importing less, remember the current account deficit means we import more than we export, then this means that there'll be less demand for our currency. So demand is going to fall from, let's say, D1 to D2. And the combined effect is, I'll use a different color. Oops. Kind of missed the mark on that one. And so the combined effect is that sort of drop in the exchange rate. Okay, so let's provide some commentary. The current account balance reflects the difference between a country's exports and imports of goods, services, income, and transfers. Lebanon's persistent current account deficit means that the country imports more than it exports. A decrease in exports means foreigners demand less Lebanese pounds, and demand falls from D1 to D2. At the same time, an increase in imports will lead to increased demand for foreign currencies, like the US dollar, and importers have to supply more Lebanese pounds to purchase this foreign currency, and supply increases from S1 to S2. Here, of course, I'm assuming that you're looking at things from the perspective of the Lebanese, so the US dollars are considered as foreign currency. The combined effect is a fall in the exchange rate of the Lebanese pound from E1 to E2, and the currency depreciates. E1 to E2, not Y1 to Y2. Okay, so again, 4 marks, so 2 marks for the diagram. Make sure everything's properly annotated. You've got all the axes all correctly labeled. You've got your supply codes, demand codes labeled. And if you want, you don't really have to do this, but as I have down here, you've just got like a little extra, I don't know, bit of text here just to cover your base and say, look, E is the exchange rate, S is the supply of Lebanese pounds, blah, blah, blah. So 2 marks for that, and then probably get another 2 marks for the explainy bit. Good, let's move on. Now, part F, using a monopoly diagram, explain why a profit-maximizing state-run telecommunications firm might be making a loss. Text D paragraph 2. So let's go off and look at text D paragraph 2. Mismanagement of the state-run electricity and telecommunications sector has resulted in unreliable services and high telecommunications prices. The state-run monopoly firms make losses, and the electricity sector relies heavily on government subsidies, putting pressure on the budget deficit. Right. So what's happening here is that you've got these electricity and telecommunications companies, and they're state-run, meaning that the only place that you can get electricity or telecommunication services from is a state-run enterprise. So there's like this big giant sort of like the government provider, and that's it, right? You can't go anywhere else, right? If you want your electricity, you can only get it from these guys. If you want your telephone services or if you want your mobile services, these are the only guys that you can get it from. There's no one else that's allowed to provide electricity or telecommunications in the country. This is what is known as a monopoly. Now, what do we have to do? We're going to use this monopoly diagram. Oops. All right, so use this monopoly diagram, and we're going to explain why a profit-maximizing state-run telecommunications firm might be making a loss. So despite the fact that they've got all this monopoly power, they still might end up making a loss if they're incredibly inefficient. Okay, so let's head on to let's move over to our working space. Now, this question is a little bit tricky because you have to get the diagram just right. So to set up the diagram, we begin with like a normal demand curve, and then we have to insert this thing called the marginal revenue curve, which is like half the demand curve. Or more specifically, it has the same intercept as the demand curve, but double the gradient. So it's kind of like rotating the demand curve inwards. Anyway, the marginal revenue curve sits inside the demand curve. So it's going to look something like this. Got price, got quantity. So this is our demand curve. Now the marginal revenue curve, as I mentioned, it's going to sit inside the demand curve. So I'll call that MR. Now I'm going to assume you know what this is, but the way we draw the marginal revenue curve, like a little cheat way, is that it always has the same intercept as the demand curve. So it starts at the same spot on the vertical axis, but then because it's got double the gradient, we kind of rotate the marginal revenue curve in by 50%. So it's kind of like half the demand curve in that sense. So that's how we do the marginal revenue curve. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we need to insert our marginal cost curve, which is going to go look like this, marginal costs. And I'm going to run out of colors here. I guess I'll use red for the ATC. Should I use red? Just wondering about it. Do I have a different color? Can't be bothered. Okay, red's fine. Okay, so the next bit is that we're going to draw the ATC curve, which stands for average total costs, and this represents the average cost of producing or making a unit of this thing. Now, according to the article, the state-run enterprise is like super inefficient. If this were the case, then the ATC curve would be like really high to indicate that the average costs of production are like really high. So we draw the ATC curve a little bit above the demand curve, right, to indicate this. So ATC is going to be quite high above the demand curve. And then we have to insert the marginal cost curve, which is what I've done over here, which is kind of like the supply curve for the individual firm. So it has this kind of upward slope like any regular supply curve. And then, so we've got the diagram set up. We can go ahead and answer the question. Okay, so, sorry, I'm just trying to think how to explain this because I'm kind of running out of colors here. Fine, I'll use like green or something. Okay, so what's going to happen is that in a profit maximizing condition, right? Any profit maximizing condition is that firms will produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? So you can make a note of this. MR equals MC. And so this is this quote unquote profit maximizing point. And what you then do is that you draw the marginal, sorry, you trace at the point where MI equals MC, you trace the price according to the demand curve. So P is given by price is going to be given by P. And then you go a little bit upwards to the ATC curve, and that's going to show you the average cost. And so what we can see here is that the average total cost is actually greater than the price. So here, make a note of that. Say ATC greater than price, therefore losses. So rather than making a profit, you're actually losing money because you're at this profit maximizing point, your average costs of production are greater than the price, which is what you can receive. So it costs me like $11 to make something, but I can only sell it for $10. So here, at any given level of production, you're going to be losing money. So you're no longer making profits, you're actually losing. Okay, as I said, that's a little bit tricky. You kind of need to know how this thing works. All right, so again, here's the diagram, and down here, we're going to provide some commentary around that diagram. A monopoly is a market structure where a single firm dominates the market, often with significant control over prices and output. However, if the firm is inefficient, poorly managed, or constrained by policies that prevent it from achieving profit maximization conditions, it may incur losses despite being the sole provider. The demand curve, marginal revenue curve, average total cost curve, and marginal cost curve for telecommunications is shown in the diagram above. In order to maximize profit or minimize losses, monopolies will produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This is shown as point A in the diagram above, and quantity is Q1. The market price will be determined by the demand curve at Q1. This is shown as P1 in the diagram above. The average total cost, ATC, for the firm at Q1 is shown as ATC 1 in the diagram above. If the firm is inefficient, the ATC curve will lie above the demand curve, and at the profit maximizing output level, average total costs are greater than prices, meaning that the firm receives less in revenue than the costs of production. Therefore, the firm will experience losses rather than generate profit. Okay, so it's made, I think I've got to write P1 rather than ATC1, and we need to annotate point A over here. Right, so yeah, so that's the diagram, and down here we've got the explainy bit. Okay, so all good. Let's move on. Last, we've got part G, which is like this, which is always like the huge, which is like the big one at the end. It's worth 15 marks, as you can see. So definitely we don't want to mess this one up. Using information from the text/data and your knowledge of economics, discuss the impact of the proposed IMF conditions, text F paragraph 1, on Lebanon's economic growth and economic development. Okay, so let's look at text F paragraph 1. So here we've got some reform strategies. So the Lebanese government is seeking help from the IMF to restructure the government debt and develop its infrastructure. However, loans from the IMF will require the following conditions to be met. So we've got a whole bunch of these conditions. One, procedures and processes established to ensure good governance, including enforcement of anti-corruption laws. B, financial sector reforms, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm going to let you read this in your own time because in the interest of time saving, I'm not going to go through each and every single one. So yeah, okay. So this is going to be a kind of a big one. So essentially what's happening is that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, have come along and said, okay, if you want us to continue providing aid to you, there are these 5 conditions that have to be met. And what we have to do is discuss the impact of these conditions on Lebanon's economic growth and economic development. So that is the task. Okay. Now, my strategy is to first define some key terms. And again, I'm just being pedantic, but I think economic growth and economic development are actually, while they're related concepts, they're slightly different. So we're going to define both. So here we've got economic growth and economic development. So, okay, so as usual, I like to have this section here for like key terms. And then we're going to have this section here for all the different IMF conditions. So the first condition is good governance. Second condition is financial sector reforms, etc. So we've got all these different conditions that the IMF are proposing. And then we're going to analyze each one on their impact on economic growth and on the impact on economic development. Now, again, I'm being very pedantic here. You probably don't have to do this level. If you just kind of combine these two, it's probably sufficient. And you probably wouldn't have to discuss every single one. I'd say just pick a handful, like maybe 3 or 4 or something, and that'll be good enough. But for the sake of completeness, I'm going to do sort of, I'll do everything. And then you can sort of decide how much of this you want to use. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the first key term, which is over here on economic growth. The increase in a country's real output of goods and services over time, measured by GDP. All right, so that's the definition for economic growth. And for economic development, a broader measure of welfare, including improvements in living standards, education, healthcare, and income distribution. Okay, that's the definition for economic development. And lastly, I've got one here for interventionist supply-side policies, because I think these are sort of, again, it's related. These are the specific policies that the IMF is referring to. You don't have to define them, but I'm just going to do it for the sake of completeness. Policies where the government directly intervenes to improve the productive capacity of the economy, such as investing in infrastructure or enforcing government reforms. Okay, so that'll do us for the key terms. Next, I'm going to go through each of those IMF conditions, and we'll sort of analyze the impact. So the first one is good governance and anti-corruption laws. So how's this going to affect the economy? Reducing corruption improves resource allocation, potentially increasing government revenue and productivity, Increased efficiency and trust in institutions may attract foreign investment, shifting the aggregate supply curve outward. Okay, so here throughout these things, you kind of always want to link back to your knowledge of economic theory. So you want to show off, right? You want to say, okay, so this is the thing, and this is how this is how it relates to the economic theory. So here, if you sort of say, well, if you fix this thing, then you're going to grow aggregate supply. So this is demonstrating to the examiner that you understand aggregate demand and supply, right? So you always kind of want to weave in these little bits of economic theory. Better governance enhances the provision of public goods like education and healthcare, addressing structural barriers to development. Okay, so that kind of does it for the first policy, which is about good governance and anti-corruption laws. Now, the second policy that the IMF is requesting is financial sector reforms and capital flight control. So the impact on economic growth. Restoring confidence in the banking sector encourages domestic savings and investments. Potentially breaking the poverty cycle. Controls on capital flight retain funds within the economy. Supporting investment and consumption. All right, so that's the first bit. Now, for the second bit on the impact on economic development, a stable financial system reduces uncertainty for households and businesses, fostering economic stability. Now, I'm just going to have an extra little section here to talk about some challenges, because it's not always easy to do these things. These reforms may take time to yield results, and short-term uncertainty could reduce investor confidence. That's just like a little thing you might want to throw in there, just to show off or demonstrate that you know what you're doing. The third policy is about reduction in government spending and increasing taxation on luxury goods, by the way, not sort of general taxes. Higher taxes on luxury goods and high-income earners may increase government revenue, reducing the budget deficit. Reduced government spending on subsidies may lower aggregate demand in the short term, potentially contracting real output and causing a leftward shift in aggregate demand. There you go. So again, you want to always sort of try to link it back to economic theory. So if you sort of mention things like aggregate demand and supply, it's usually a good thing. Oh, whoops, I wasn't done with this first bit. Indirect taxation, if levied on intermediate inputs, could raise the cost of production, leading to reduced aggregate supply and cost push inflation. A progressive tax system would help redistribute income from high-income earners to lower-income earners, thus reducing inequality and bringing the Lorenz curve closer to the 45-degree line of equality and a reduction to the Gini coefficient. However, an increase in indirect taxes especially if levied on necessities, could have a disproportionate effect on low-income households, which further increases inequality. This would be shown by a further movement of the Lorenz curve away from the 45-degree line of equality and an increase to the Gini coefficient. Okay, so that's kind of like the impact on economic growth. Now, the second bit here about the impact on economic development, I would say something like reduced government spending on welfare programs could exacerbate poverty. Okay, the next, I guess, condition that the IMF is requesting is the privatization of those utility firms, right? So breaking up those monopolies that we discussed in the previous section. All right, so in terms of the impact on economic growth, increased efficiency in the electricity and telecommunications sector may reduce production costs and attract investment. Exploration of new energy sources and improvements in the telecommunications infrastructure could expand the production possibilities curve. So again, if we were to, let's say, privatize those monopolies, sort of break up those monopolies and allow them to sort of behave more efficiently, then we could expand production. And so typically we can use something like a PPC to represent that growth in productivity. More reliable utilities improve quality of life and access to essential services. Private sector investment into infrastructure could lead to better quality of service and fewer blackouts and disruptions to service. Now, in terms of challenges, obviously there's always going to be some challenges. Ensuring that the newly privatized entity does not abuse its monopoly power by charging above market prices for utilities and essential services. This could be mitigated by establishing regulatory bodies and watchdog agencies. However, regulatory capture could occur if lobby groups become too influential. Right, so what we're saying here is that, okay, you can break up those those monopolies and allow private sector sort of take over and start producing these services. However, if you sort of don't regulate these industries, it's possible that some of these private sector entities could gain monopoly power, and you'd be back at the same problem as before, which is they're going to abuse that monopoly power. So to counteract this, you can create things like watchdog agencies to monitor and sort of take action if required. Okay, the last bit here, the last recommendation is a transition to a floating exchange rate. And this is going to have impact on, on a whole bunch of things, as you'd imagine. A floating exchange rate allows the currency to adjust based on market forces, potentially improving export competitiveness. This would also encourage tourism to the country as domestic goods and services become cheaper for foreigners. However, a depreciation of the Lebanese pound could lead to cost-push inflation if imports become more expensive, reducing real output in the short term as the aggregate supply curve contracts. Demand management policies will improve as monetary becomes more effective, as it is no longer required to manage the exchange rate. policy. Okay, so what we're saying here is that if you transition from a fixed to a floating exchange rate, then it's got all these benefits. In addition, it might allow the currency to adjust to a more competitive level, right? And so this can bring in things like tourism and all this sort of stuff. And also, one of the important things is that if you run a system of fixed exchange rates, then your monetary policy is essentially kind of useless because you're committing your monetary policy to maintaining that fixed rate. So if you transition from the fixed to the floating exchange rate, you regain the use of monetary policy, which is like a really useful policy to manage the economy. So I think, yeah, but that's kind of like more advanced kind of macro stuff. I'm not sure if you need to know that. Now, in terms of the impact on economic development, export-driven growth can create jobs and reduce unemployment, contributing to poverty alleviation. However, higher import prices may worsen living standards in the short term. So in terms of challenges, obviously, again, we're not saying that these things are foolproof. We're always going to have problems. Managing exchange rate volatility will require strong monetary policy coordination. Central bank independence is vital and must be free from government intervention. So just to finish off, might have some, like a summary or some general considerations. So if we talk about things like debt restructuring, reducing debt repayments burdens frees up resources for productive investment, fostering both growth and development. And you might also want to provide funds for infrastructure development as well. Improved infrastructure supports long-term growth by enhancing productivity and connectivity. Now, in terms of some of the negative impacts of some of these policies, the first impact is might have some short-term contraction, right? So you might have problems in the short term. Austerity measures may contract aggregate demand, reducing growth in the short term. You're also going to get increase in inequality as well. Higher indirect taxes and reduced subsidies could worsen poverty and inequality. Okay, and so yeah, that's it for this particular question. I think there's plenty of stuff there. As I said before, you don't have to do every single thing here. I've gone overboard. Just pick a few, maybe just 2 or 3 of these things, and sort of elaborate on them. And I think that will be sufficient to get you your full marks. Look, 15 marks for the entire question. You've probably already gotten a few marks just for defining some key terms, and then the rest of your marks will come from maybe like 3 or 4 marks for each of these sort of discussion bits over here. So yeah, that's it from me. Any questions, just let me know in the comment section. I guess we're done for this particular paper. So cool. I'll see you next time.